The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, painting the quiet neighborhood in shades of orange and gold. The streets were calm, almost serene, lined with well-kept houses and trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The Johnsons' house sat at the corner, slightly larger than the others, with a garden that had been tended for decades. Every flower, bush, and tree seemed to tell a story, each carefully planted and cared for over the years. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson moved about their home in a rhythm born from years of routine. Mrs. Johnson was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she always did, humming softly to herself. Mr. Johnson sat in his favorite armchair, a book in hand, though his eyes often wandered to the window, watching the neighborhood that had been his home for so long. They had lived there for nearly 50 years, raising children, celebrating milestones, and weathering life's hardships together. They had seen the neighborhood change over time, watched new families move in, and maintained friendships with many neighbors. Most people respected them for their kindness, generosity, and the wisdom they had accumulated over the years. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared the same warmth in their hearts. A few streets away, a group of teenagers sat on the curb, whispering and laughing. They were loud, brash, and full of a reckless energy that often drew attention. Their parents were aware of their antics but had grown weary of trying to control them. The teens had formed a tight group, feeding off each other's audacity. That evening, one of them suggested something that made the others smirk and exchange glances. They had noticed the Johnsons' house for weeks, their minds filled with a mixture of envy, prejudice, and the thrill of rebellion. "Let's go mess with that house," one of them said, a cruel excitement in his voice. The others nodded eagerly. They had no plan beyond causing trouble, but that was part of the thrill for them. As the sun sank lower, the teenagers slipped quietly through the streets, careful to avoid any neighbors who might be outside. Their laughter was low and conspiratorial, each step fueled by the adrenaline of what they were about to do. They approached the Johnsons' home with a sense of daring, imagining the shock on the couple's faces. It was a small, twisted game to them, but for the Johnsons, it would be a violation of their sanctuary, a shock that cut deep into their sense of safety and peace. Meanwhile, inside the house, Mrs. Johnson hummed as she chopped vegetables, the scent of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen. Mr. Johnson had put down his book and leaned back in his chair, enjoying the quiet of the evening. The neighborhood was calm and they felt secure as they always had. They had no idea that outside a storm of cruelty was approaching their home. The teens crept closer, their faces shadowed in the dim light. They carried spray paint cans, stones, and other small objects they had picked up, eager to leave their mark. One of them whispered, "Watch, they'll freak out when they see this." Another laughed softly, the sound almost drowned by the gentle rustle of the trees. The Johnsons remained unaware, absorbed in their evening routine, their minds filled with memories and the comfort of a life built over decades. Then it began. One of the teens lifted a spray paint can and pressed it against the side of the house. A hateful message appeared in bold letters, jarring against the carefully painted walls. Another teen tossed a rock through a garden window, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the quiet street, making the couple jump in alarm. Mrs. Johnson dropped the knife she had been using and rushed to the living room, where Mr. Johnson was already on his feet, concern etched on his face. They quickly realized what was happening. Their home, their safe space, was being attacked. Their hearts pounded, but neither panicked. They had faced life's challenges together, and they knew that anger and fear could not solve this. The teens laughed as they continued, throwing objects, scribbling hateful words, and enjoying the chaos they created. They felt powerful, untouchable, feeding off each other's courage. Yet in their excitement, they did not notice how close the couple was to calling the authorities. Mr. Johnson reached for the phone with steady hands, his eyes never leaving the teens outside. "Mrs. Johnson," her voice calm but firm, said, "Let them finish. We will handle this the right way." There was a quiet strength in her words that seemed to cut through the chaos. Finally, satisfied with the mess they had created, the teens ran off into the growing darkness, their laughter fading as they disappeared around the corner. The Johnsons surveyed the damage. Their beautiful home was marred by hateful graffiti, shattered glass, and the sense of violation that weighed heavily on them. It was not just the physical damage that hurt, it was the knowledge that someone could harbor such hatred and feel justified in acting on it. But despite the pain and anger, The couple did not succumb to despair. Mr. Johnson dialed the local police station, reporting the incident with clear, calm words. Mrs. Johnson began gathering neighbors who were willing to help, not with anger, but with the intention of restoring peace and order. Slowly, word spread through the neighborhood. People came to offer their support, bringing cleaning supplies, ladders, and tools. Children watched with wide eyes, learning an unspoken lesson about standing together in the face of wrongdoing. The Johnsons' response surprised many. Instead of retaliation, they showed resilience and dignity. Their calm approach became a quiet lesson for the neighborhood, a reminder that hate could be met with courage rather than fear. The teenagers, oblivious to the strength of their victims, had expected a reaction born of anger or fear. Instead, they left behind an example of how grace and moral strength could transform even the darkest moments into an opportunity for community solidarity and personal growth. As night fell, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. The Johnsons stood together, surveying their home, the damage, and the efforts of their neighbors. Their hearts were heavy, but they also felt a sense of hope. They knew that the world could be cruel, but it could also be filled with kindness, support, and resilience. The evening had been a harsh reminder of the hatred that existed, but it had also highlighted the strength of the human spirit when faced with adversity. The couple returned to their routines, but now with a renewed sense of purpose, to protect their home, their community, and the values they held dear. The events of that night would not be forgotten. The neighborhood would remember the courage of the elderly couple and the way the community came together. The teenagers, in their arrogance, had underestimated the power of dignity, patience, and unity. They had thought they could terrorize an elderly couple and gain some twisted sense of power. Instead, they had set the stage for lessons that would ripple through the neighborhood for years to come. The Johnson story, even in that first evening of chaos, became a testament to the strength of character, the importance of community, and the quiet power of standing tall in the face of injustice. The morning after the attack was quiet, but the air was heavy with the events of the previous night. The Johnsons woke early, not from fear, but from a sense of purpose. Mr. Johnson stepped onto the porch, looking at the spray-painted walls and broken windows. Shaking his head slowly, Mrs. Johnson joined him, carrying a cup of tea, her face calm but resolute. They had been through hardships before, but this felt different. This was not just about a broken window or vandalism. It was about hatred directed at them for no reason, yet they refused to let it define their day or their spirit. Word about the vandalism spread quickly through the neighborhood. Those who lived nearby came to see the damage, many stopping to offer support, a kind word or just a listening ear. Some neighbors were shocked, unable to understand how anyone could commit such acts, especially against a couple who had always shown nothing but kindness. Children from the area watched curiously, some asking questions, others whispering to their friends about what had happened. It became clear that the actions of the teens had a ripple effect far beyond the Johnsons' home. The entire neighborhood felt the shock and disbelief. As neighbors gathered, the Johnsons made a quiet plan. They would not act out of anger, but they would take action. They asked for buckets, brushes, and cleaning supplies, and together, a group of community members began the process of washing away the spray paint and repairing minor damages. It was hard work and their hands became dirty, but there was laughter and conversation among them. Stories of past kindnesses and shared memories filled the air, creating a sense of unity that the vandals could never have anticipated. Meanwhile, the teenagers were still unaware of the growing consequences of their actions. Some of them laughed and joked about what they had done the night before, posting pictures and videos on social media. They believed their actions were clever, that they had outsmarted everyone. But the posts quickly began to attract attention in ways they had not expected. Friends from other neighborhoods commented with disapproval. Adults began to recognize the faces in the videos, and some even shared the images with local authorities. The thrill they had felt began to fade as reality slowly caught up with them. Back at the Johnsons' house, the couple worked with their neighbors to restore what had been damaged. Each flower replanted, each window repaired, and each wall scrubbed clean was a small victory. More importantly, they were showing the neighborhood that hate could not take away their dignity or their sense of community. As they worked, Mrs. Johnson spoke softly to a young girl who had been watching, explaining that sometimes people act out of fear or ignorance, but it was always better to respond with courage and kindness than with anger. The lesson was subtle but powerful, and the children listened intently, understanding more than the adults realized. The police arrived mid-morning after receiving multiple reports. They took statements, photographed the damage, and assured the Johnsons that the teens would be held accountable. The Johnsons were calm and precise in their words, not seeking revenge but simply justice. The officers nodded, impressed by the couple's composed demeanor despite the clear emotional weight of the situation. The Johnsons made sure the officers understood that they wanted the focus to be on preventing such acts in the future, not just punishing the teens. Their approach highlighted the importance of responsibility, reflection, and the lessons that could be learned from wrongdoing. Social media continued to play a role. Neighbors shared updates about the cleanup and the Johnsons' efforts, and more people began to rally in support. Messages of encouragement poured in, some from strangers who had never met the couple but were moved by their story. Others expressed outrage at the teenagers' actions, reinforcing the message that the community would not tolerate hate. Slowly the tide was turning, and the teenagers' actions, once thought clever, were now met with growing criticism and scrutiny. The Johnsons also took time to speak with their immediate neighbors about the events. They discussed ways to ensure the neighborhood felt safe and supported. Street watch programs, community gatherings, and simple acts of kindness were suggested to rebuild a sense of security. The conversation was not focused on punishment alone, but on prevention and understanding. The elderly couple emphasized that their goal was to teach a lesson in empathy and respect, not just to highlight wrongdoing. Their wisdom and experience guided the discussions, making a deep impression on everyone present. In contrast, the teenagers began to feel the weight of their decisions. Some received phone calls from family members who had seen the social media posts and were angry and disappointed. Others were confronted by neighbors who had recognized them in the videos. Fear began to replace the thrill they had felt the night before. They had underestimated the consequences of their actions, thinking the world would simply overlook their behavior. The reality was much harsher, and the sense of invincibility they had enjoyed was fading fast. By midday, the community had made significant progress on the cleanup. Walls were scrubbed, gardens were tended, and broken items were repaired or replaced. Neighbors worked side by side, laughing, talking, and sharing meals together. The act of repairing the damage became more than just restoring property. It became a symbol of resilience, unity, and the refusal to let hatred define their lives. The Johnsons watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the strongest message was not in punishment, but in the demonstration of collective strength and compassion. Throughout the day, the Johnsons received visits from people outside the neighborhood, all offering support and condolences. Volunteers from nearby areas arrived to help with repairs, bringing tools, supplies, and encouragement. News of the incident began to spread beyond the local community, highlighting the couple's dignity in the face of adversity. Interviews with the Johnsons were thoughtful and measured, focusing on the importance of understanding, kindness, and standing against hatred without resorting to retaliation. Their words resonated, and many who heard the story were inspired to reflect on their own actions and the treatment of others in their communities. Meanwhile, the teenagers began to experience social consequences. Friends and peers who had once admired their rebellious streak began to distance themselves, unwilling to associate with behavior that had drawn so much attention and criticism. Teachers and community leaders became involved, addressing the actions and emphasizing the need for accountability and respect. The teens, once confident and brash, were confronted with the real-world impact of their choices in ways that were both public and personal. The lessons were harsh but necessary, a reality check that could not be ignored. By evening, the neighborhood had regained a sense of calm, though the memory of the vandalism lingered. The Johnsons reflected on the day, recognizing the emotional toll but also feeling a deep sense of pride in how they had handled the situation. They had not allowed fear or anger to dictate their actions. Instead, they had turned a painful event into an opportunity for growth, education, and community solidarity. The cleanup, the conversations, and the support of neighbors had all contributed to healing the immediate wounds and strengthening the bonds within the neighborhood. The teenagers, on the other hand, began to understand the gravity of what they had done. Their initial excitement had been replaced by a growing awareness of responsibility and the consequences of their behavior. They were learning that actions driven by hate or prejudice had real impacts on real people, and that the world did not simply overlook wrongdoing. The lessons were difficult, but they were beginning to sink in, setting the stage for accountability, reflection, and eventual understanding. As night fell, the Johnsons sat together once more, exhausted but content. They had faced hatred, disruption, and fear, yet they had maintained their dignity, protected their home, and inspired their community. The neighborhood, too, had been reminded of the power of unity, kindness, and standing together in the face of injustice. The story of that day would remain in everyone's minds not as a tale of victimhood, but as a powerful lesson in resilience, empathy, and the strength of the human spirit. Even the youngest children who had watched the events unfold would carry the memory of courage and compassion, a lesson that would shape their understanding of right and wrong for years to come. The days following the vandalism passed slowly, but the tension in the neighborhood remained. The Johnsons had restored most of the damage to their home, thanks to the help of supportive neighbors and volunteers who had come to show solidarity. Every scrubbed wall and repaired window felt like a small victory, a quiet but powerful statement that hatred could not destroy their peace. Yet even with repairs underway, the emotional impact lingered. The couple still felt the sting of knowing that teenagers had acted out of prejudice, and while they did not let anger control them, they were acutely aware that lessons needed to be learned and justice had to follow. Meanwhile, the teenagers who had caused the havoc began to face consequences they had not expected. Their social media posts, once a source of pride, had become evidence of their misdeeds. Friends who had once cheered them on now looked at them with disappointment or disapproval. Parents called them into long talks about respect, responsibility, and the real-world consequences of their actions. Teachers who had already been hearing rumors began asking questions. The teenagers began to understand that their reckless decisions could no longer be ignored. For the first time, some of them felt genuine fear, not of punishment alone, but of the embarrassment and shame that came from seeing the disappointment in others' eyes. The Johnsons, despite all that had happened, continued their routine. Mr. Johnson tended his garden while Mrs. Johnson cleaned the last remaining glass shards from the broken window. They were mindful of their own mental health, making sure they did not allow the incident to dominate their thoughts. They talked to each other about the importance of keeping perspective and maintaining their dignity. They were careful not to let the hatred of a few influence their sense of humanity. Their focus remained on the community and on teaching the next generation that patience, courage, and empathy were far more powerful than anger and revenge. As word of the teens' behavior spread through the local community, a sense of accountability began to grow. Neighbors began sharing information with the authorities, helping to identify the individuals responsible. Some of the teens' friends who had been silent witnesses decided to speak up, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Their stories, combined with the evidence from social media, provided law enforcement with a clear understanding of what had happened. The teens were no longer invisible. Their actions had consequences, and the web of accountability began to tighten around them. One afternoon, as the Johnsons worked in their garden, a local police officer visited their home. He was respectful and professional, taking time to listen to their account of the events. The Johnsons recounted everything with calm precision, emphasizing that they were seeking justice, not revenge. The officer nodded, understanding that the situation was more complex than simple vandalism. Hate crimes were serious matters, and in this case, the teenagers' actions carried emotional, social, and legal weight. The officer promised that the investigation would be thorough and that the community would be kept informed. The Johnsons thanked him, appreciating the fairness and diligence being applied. During this time, the teenagers were experiencing the first hints of immediate consequences, or karma as some might call it. One of them, walking through a local store parking lot, slipped on a patch of oil and fell, injuring an arm. It was a small injury, nothing life-threatening, but it left him humbled and frustrated. Another teen was caught by security while attempting to take items from a convenience store. The embarrassment of being confronted in front of strangers, combined with the growing awareness of how their actions were being noticed, began to chip away at the arrogance that had fueled their reckless behavior. They were beginning to understand that the world did not ignore wrongdoings, and that their actions had ripple effects far beyond what they could see. Meanwhile, The Johnsons' efforts to repair their home and support the community continued. Neighbors organized a small gathering to discuss what had happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. There was laughter, conversation, and serious discussion. Older residents shared their experiences and wisdom, reminding everyone that unity and compassion were crucial in times of challenge. Children listened intently, some asking questions about why people could be cruel and how to respond. The Johnsons answered patiently, explaining that while some people might act out of ignorance or fear, the important thing was to respond with courage, understanding, and empathy rather than revenge or hatred. In the evenings, the Johnsons would sit together on the porch, reflecting on the events and the lessons they had learned. They spoke about resilience, morality, and the importance of protecting their sense of self and their home. The neighborhood had come together in ways that the teenagers had never anticipated. Acts of kindness, solidarity, and care had reinforced the idea that hatred could never truly overcome community strength. The Johnsons felt proud not just of their own actions, but of how the neighborhood had united around a shared sense of justice and compassion. The teenagers, on the other hand, were starting to face public embarrassment. Their social media accounts, once a place to boast about their actions, had become sources of judgment. Some of their videos had been shared widely, drawing negative attention and criticism. Teachers, parents, and peers all became involved, emphasizing the seriousness of their actions. The once confident and brazen teens were now confronted with the reality of social and legal consequences, and the thrill they had felt was replaced by anxiety and shame. This first taste of real accountability was a wake-up call, marking the beginning of a journey they had not expected. As the investigation continued, the Johnsons were called upon to provide more detailed statements. They remained composed, clear, and precise, offering information that would help the authorities hold the teens accountable. Their focus was not on vengeance, but on ensuring that a lesson was learned and that the teenagers would understand the consequences of their actions. The couple's dignity in this process became an example for the entire neighborhood, demonstrating that strength and morality could guide responses to wrongdoing. The neighborhood itself began to transform. What had started as an act of hate became a catalyst for unity and reflection. Residents organized cleanup initiatives, community watch programs, and gatherings to reinforce positive values and ensure everyone felt safe. People shared stories of resilience and courage, creating a narrative that contrasted sharply with the teenagers' reckless behavior. The Johnsons' calm, wise, and compassionate approach became the centerpiece of these conversations, inspiring others to act with similar integrity. The teenagers were gradually beginning to recognize the depth of the consequences they faced. Some had to explain their behavior to family members who were deeply disappointed. Some faced school disciplinary actions, including community service, counseling, and public apologies. Each step forced them to confront the reality of their actions and consider how their choices affected real people. It was a slow, uncomfortable process, but one that planted the seeds of understanding and accountability. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt a renewed sense of hope and connection. The Johnsons had successfully repaired much of the damage, and the community had grown stronger through shared effort. Children, neighbors, and volunteers had all learned a powerful lesson about resilience, compassion, and the importance of standing together against hatred. The teenagers, though still grappling with the consequences of their actions, had begun to experience the first real signs of karma, understanding that cruelty could never go unnoticed. The Johnsons continued their daily routines with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Every task, from gardening to cooking to simple conversations with neighbors, carried the weight of their experience and the strength they had demonstrated. They had faced hatred and disruption, yet they had maintained their dignity and inspired those around them. Their story was spreading beyond the immediate neighborhood, offering a lesson in courage, empathy, and moral fortitude. Even the youngest children in the area were beginning to internalize these lessons, learning that respect, patience, and kindness were far more powerful than fear or anger. As night fell once more, the Johnsons sat on their porch reflecting on the past week. They spoke softly about how difficult it was to face hate directly, yet how rewarding it was to see the community come together. They recognized that their actions, combined with the support of their neighbors, had created a ripple effect that would have lasting impacts. They understood that true strength was not in retaliation, but in the ability to maintain one's principles while encouraging understanding and growth in others. The teenagers, meanwhile, were left to confront the unfolding reality of their choices. Their arrogance and bravado had been replaced by an awareness of consequence. Social, familial, and legal pressures combined to create a new understanding that actions driven by hatred had lasting impacts, and that real accountability could not be ignored. This realization, though difficult, was the first step toward growth, reflection, and eventual redemption. In this way, the story of the Johnsons and the teenagers entered a new phase. The initial shock and anger had given way to understanding, reflection, and the first signs of justice. The neighborhood had come together to support the Johnsons and reinforce positive values. The teenagers were beginning to learn that their choices mattered and that the world would respond to wrongdoing. The stage was set for further consequences, lessons, and transformations, all rooted in the human capacity for empathy, courage, and moral integrity. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly settled back into a sense of normalcy. But the events surrounding the Johnsons' home continued to ripple through the community. The teenagers who had vandalized the house were beginning to experience the consequences of their actions in ways they had never imagined. They were no longer invisible or untouchable. Their behavior had set off a chain of events that would impact them socially, emotionally, and legally. Parents, teachers, and peers all took notice, emphasizing responsibility, respect, and the importance of understanding the effects of one's actions. The teenagers who had once laughed at the thought of getting caught now faced the reality that every decision had weight, and their reckless choices could not be ignored. The Johnsons, in contrast, continued to exemplify calm dignity and wisdom. They remained deeply involved with the community, organizing meetings and discussions that focused not only on what had happened, but also on preventing similar incidents in the future. One evening, they hosted a neighborhood gathering in their restored garden, inviting everyone from young children to the elderly. The goal was not punishment, but understanding, empathy, and education. They spoke openly about the events, explaining how hate and prejudice could impact lives, while also sharing lessons on patience, resilience, and the importance of responding with compassion rather than anger. During this gathering, several neighbors suggested initiatives to ensure safety and foster a stronger sense of community. They discussed forming neighborhood watch groups, organizing regular social events to bring everyone together, and creating mentoring programs for younger residents to learn about respect and empathy. The Johnsons supported these ideas wholeheartedly, seeing them as opportunities to turn a painful event into a catalyst for long-term positive change. The teenagers who had begun to hear about these initiatives from other community members felt the first pangs of social pressure. Their actions were not being ignored, and the community was making it clear that respect and accountability were non-negotiable. As the legal process progressed, the police began contacting the teenagers and their families. The consequences ranged from fines to mandatory community service and participation in educational programs about the impacts of discrimination and vandalism. The teenagers, who had previously believed they could act without repercussions, now faced a structured system that forced them to reflect on their choices. Their parents, some frustrated and some saddened, worked alongside the authorities to ensure that lessons were learned and that the teens were held accountable. The Johnsons, while not seeking revenge, were asked to participate in a restorative justice program. This program allowed the teenagers to meet with them under supervision, providing an opportunity for dialogue. Initially, the teens were hesitant, embarrassed, and even defiant, but the Johnsons remained calm and respectful. They explained how the vandalism and harassment had affected their daily lives, their sense of safety, and their emotional well-being. They spoke not with anger but with honesty, describing the hurt caused by prejudice and hate. The teenagers listened, some with guilt, some with disbelief, and some with a growing sense of responsibility. The encounter was eye-opening, marking the first time many of them truly understood the human impact of their actions. The conversations during the restorative justice sessions were not easy. There were moments of tension, tears, and awkward silence, but gradually, understanding began to emerge. The teenagers were confronted with the reality that their actions had consequences beyond what they had imagined. They were learning that power does not come from intimidation or destruction, but from empathy, accountability, and the ability to make amends. The Johnsons, through their patience and willingness to educate rather than punish, guided the teens toward this understanding, planting seeds that could grow into genuine personal growth. Outside of these sessions, the neighborhood continued to rally around the Johnsons. Volunteers helped maintain their home and garden. Children were encouraged to participate in activities that promoted kindness, and local organizations began offering workshops on community values, empathy, and conflict resolution. The incident, once a source of fear and anger, had transformed into an opportunity for community strengthening and education. The Johnsons' role in this transformation was central. Their wisdom, calmness, and courage inspired others to act with integrity and kindness. The teens began participating in community service projects as part of their restitution. They helped clean public spaces, paint murals, and assist with events designed to bring people together. Initially, some were reluctant and resistant, but over time, the act of contributing positively to the community began to shift their perspective. They began to see that their previous behavior had been selfish and harmful, and that true fulfillment came from helping others rather than causing pain. Each project, small as it seemed, chipped away at the arrogance and ignorance that had fueled their misdeeds. At home, the Johnsons continued to lead by example. They welcomed conversations with neighbors, provided guidance to younger residents, and maintained their daily routines with grace. Mr. Johnson tended his garden with care, while Mrs. Johnson prepared meals and hosted discussions on respect, empathy, and resilience. Their commitment to teaching by example was powerful, demonstrating that morality and compassion could influence not just the immediate situation, but also the future actions and attitudes of those around them. The impact on the teenagers became more evident over time. They began to reflect on how their actions had affected not only the Johnsons, but also their own families, friends, and the broader community. Some expressed regret and apologized sincerely during the restorative sessions. Others, though still struggling to fully comprehend the depth of their mistakes, showed signs of increased awareness and responsibility. These moments, small but significant, highlighted the power of accountability and education in transforming behavior. Community leaders, seeing the positive developments, encouraged further engagement. Workshops, mentorship programs, and group discussions became regular occurrences, providing safe spaces for dialogue, learning, and growth. The Johnsons were central to these initiatives, their calm wisdom and experience guiding the conversations. The neighborhood slowly evolved, with residents united in their commitment to respect, understanding, and mutual support. The incident, once a source of fear and tension, had become a catalyst for positive change and lasting lessons. Through it all, the Johnsons remained humble and focused on the bigger picture. They did not seek praise or recognition, only the opportunity to teach and protect. Their patience, integrity, and compassion became a beacon for the community, showing that even in the face of hate, individuals could inspire change and foster understanding. The neighborhood learned that courage was not always loud or aggressive, but often quiet, steady, and rooted in the desire to do what was right. By the end of the month, the teenagers had begun to see real consequences for their actions, both socially and personally. They had participated in community service, engaged in honest conversations with the Johnsons, and faced the disappointment and guidance of their families and mentors. Slowly, the arrogance and thoughtlessness that had driven their initial behavior were being replaced by awareness, responsibility, and in some cases, genuine remorse. The process was ongoing, but the first signs of transformation were clear. The Johnsons, for their part, continued to nurture their home, their garden, and their community. Their actions had created a ripple effect, influencing not just the immediate neighborhood but also the broader understanding of how empathy, patience, and moral courage could counteract hate. They knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but they also knew that their example and the support of the community would help guide the next steps. Their story, full of quiet strength and human resilience, had become a lesson in the power of dignity, empathy, and the positive impact that one couple could have on an entire neighborhood. Even the youngest children who had witnessed the events or heard the stories began to internalize lessons about respect and kindness. They saw that actions driven by prejudice and cruelty had consequences, and that responding with integrity, understanding, and compassion could make a lasting difference. The neighborhood, once shaken by hate, now held a stronger, more cohesive sense of community. The Johnsons' presence, wisdom, and example had transformed fear and anger into hope, learning, and growth. In this way, the story moved from a moment of violence and cruelty into a larger narrative of justice, reflection, and transformation. The teenagers were beginning to experience the first true consequences of their actions, guided by legal systems, family, and the moral example of the Johnsons. The community, once passive observers, became active participants in promoting understanding, empathy, and respect. And the Johnsons, with their steady courage and patience, continued to lead by example, proving that even in the darkest moments, human dignity and compassion could prevail, creating a ripple effect of positive change that would be felt for years to come. Months had passed since the teenagers had vandalized the Johnsons' home. The immediate anger and shock had faded, but the lessons and consequences were far from over. The community had grown stronger, more connected, and more aware of the importance of standing against hate. The Johnsons had continued their work quietly, but with an unshakable resolve to protect their home, nurture their neighborhood, and teach by example. Every day they demonstrated the power of patience, empathy, and moral courage, reminding everyone that true strength was not in retaliation, but in the ability to remain dignified and compassionate even in the face of adversity. The teenagers, who had once laughed at the idea of consequences, were now deeply aware of the ripple effect their actions had caused. Their participation in community service and restorative justice programs had opened their eyes to the real impact of their behavior. They had worked alongside neighbors to clean public areas, help organize community events, and even assist in programs teaching younger children about empathy and respect. Each task reminded them of their mistakes, and slowly, their arrogance was replaced with humility. The first few weeks had been awkward and uncomfortable, but over time a sense of responsibility began to grow. They began to understand that true respect could only be earned through actions, not through fear or destruction. The Johnsons continued to provide guidance and support, not just for the teenagers but for the neighborhood as a whole. They hosted weekly gatherings where residents could discuss community issues, share ideas, and work together on projects that promoted understanding and cooperation. These gatherings became a safe space where dialogue could occur without judgment, where lessons were learned through conversation and shared experience rather than punishment alone. Children were encouraged to ask questions, share their thoughts, and engage in activities that fostered empathy and critical thinking. The Johnsons emphasized that the ultimate goal was to create a neighborhood where kindness and respect were the norm, and prejudice had no place. One day, a group of the teenagers approached the Johnsons nervous and hesitant. They wanted to apologize directly, not just as part of a program, but because they truly understood the harm they had caused. The Johnsons welcomed them warmly, listening patiently as each teen spoke. Some tears were shed, some hands shook in nervousness, but honesty and remorse were evident. The Johnsons responded with gentle words, acknowledging the courage it took to admit mistakes and encouraging the teenagers to continue learning and growing. It was a pivotal moment, a turning point that marked the beginning of genuine understanding and personal transformation. As the legal obligations were completed, including fines, community service, and mandatory educational programs, the teenagers began to feel a sense of relief mixed with pride in their progress. They had faced the consequences, learned lessons, and had begun to make amends. More importantly, they had started to understand that their actions had real effects on real people, and that respect and kindness were far more powerful than hate and intimidation. Their journey was far from complete, but the first steps toward accountability, empathy, and moral growth had been taken. The neighborhood continued to thrive, strengthened by the shared experience. Volunteers helped the Johnsons maintain their home and garden, and community members came together to organize events that celebrated culture, diversity, and unity. Children played freely in safe streets, learning the value of cooperation, friendship, and understanding. Neighbors who had previously been casual acquaintances now worked closely together, reinforcing a sense of belonging and mutual support. The community had transformed, and the Johnsons' influence was evident in the positive changes that rippled through the area. The Johnsons themselves found a renewed sense of purpose and fulfillment. They were no longer just caretakers of their home and garden. They had become pillars of the community, guiding others through example and thoughtful mentorship. They continued to host gatherings, provide support to struggling families, and engage with children to teach lessons about respect, empathy, and resilience. Their quiet courage had inspired a network of caring individuals who understood that true strength lay in kindness and moral integrity. Over time, the teenagers began to take on leadership roles in the very community they had once disrupted. They organized cleanup drives, helped mentor younger children, and participated in discussions about conflict resolution and the dangers of prejudice. Their journey from recklessness to responsibility became an example for others, illustrating how accountability, reflection, and genuine remorse could transform behavior. While they would always carry the memory of their mistakes, they were learning to use those experiences as motivation to make positive contributions rather than repeat past errors. The Johnsons watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, knowing that their approach had made a lasting impact. They had chosen not to respond with anger, but with patience and guidance, creating an environment where learning and growth were possible. The community's transformation was a testament to the power of empathy and moral courage, proving that even in the face of hate, positive change could be achieved through understanding, patience, and principled action. As the seasons changed, the Johnsons' garden flourished once again, symbolizing the neighborhood's renewal. Flowers bloomed, trees stood tall, and children's laughter echoed through the streets. The home that had once been a target of hatred now stood as a symbol of resilience, dignity, and community strength. Neighbors and visitors alike marveled at the unity and warmth that had developed, inspired by the Johnsons' example. The story of the vandalism and its aftermath had transformed into a narrative of hope, learning, and growth, illustrating that even the darkest moments could lead to profound positive change. The teenagers, now more aware of their responsibilities and the impact of their actions, continued to work alongside the community. They shared their experiences with peers, explaining how easily anger and prejudice could lead to harmful decisions, and how accountability and empathy could change the course of one's life. Their honesty and openness served as a bridge, helping others understand the importance of making thoughtful choices and standing against hate. Slowly, their reputation shifted from troublemakers to young individuals learning and contributing positively, earning the trust and respect of neighbors and mentors alike. The Johnsons remained humble throughout, never seeking recognition or reward. Their focus was always on the well-being of the community and the lessons that could be learned from adversity. They knew that hate could not be eradicated entirely, but they believed that its power could be diminished through consistent, principled action. Their story and the transformation it inspired became a source of inspiration for others in nearby neighborhoods and communities, demonstrating that dignity, patience, and moral courage could create lasting change. One evening, as the Johnsons sat on their porch reflecting on the journey from vandalism to restoration, they felt a sense of deep satisfaction. The neighborhood had healed, the teenagers had begun to understand their mistakes, and the community had grown stronger, more connected, and more resilient. The lessons learned went beyond punishment. They had become about empathy, accountability, and the enduring power of kindness. The Johnsons knew that their quiet strength had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Children played freely in the streets. Neighbors laughed together, and a renewed sense of trust and cooperation filled the air. The Johnsons' home, once the target of hate, now symbolized resilience, moral courage, and the power of community. The teenagers, though once misguided, had begun to find a path toward responsibility and positive contribution. The neighborhood had become a place where respect, empathy, and understanding were valued, and where the ripple effect of one couple's calm courage could influence many lives. The story concluded not with fear or resentment, but with hope and growth. The Johnsons had shown that standing firm in dignity, responding to hate with patience and wisdom, and fostering understanding could lead to meaningful transformation. The community, strengthened by shared experience, had learned that unity, empathy, and moral courage could overcome prejudice. The teenagers had faced consequences, learned lessons, and begun to make amends, illustrating that accountability and reflection could turn mistakes into opportunities for growth. And through it all, the Johnsons' calm, patient, and principled approach had left a lasting imprint, proving that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit could prevail, creating a future defined not by hate, but by understanding, respect, and the enduring power of kindness.